Hello, everyone. It's 12 o'clock. We'll get started now. My name's Kendra, and I'd like to thank you all so much for tuning in today for CSI Pacific's Sport Performance Speaker Series webinar that's going on today. We're lucky enough to have our Director of Performance Solutions and Innovation and Research at the Canadian Sport Institute Pacific, Dr. Trent Stellingwerff, and Professor Stuart Phillips, PhD, join us today during this hectic time in our world to talk to us about detraining and performance residuals. I'm so excited to have you all here to tune in and learn about this. Trent and Stuart will dive deeper into this space as they present this webinar, so grab your notebooks and a blanket and prepare yourself to learn. For those tuning in to a live presentation for the first time, welcome. During the presentation, please feel free to type in the chat box at any time a question you may have for Trent or Stuart, and they will try their best to answer them as they come up, or they may have some time at the end to answer any pressing questions. Also, this presentation will be recorded and posted on our on-demand Speaker Series webpage for those wanting to rewatch anything. Before I hand things over to Trent and Stu, I'd like to share with you a bit about them. Since 2011, Dr. Trent Stellingwerff serves as the Director of Performance Solutions and Innovation and Research at the Canadian Sport Institute Pacific, based out of Victoria, BC. In this role, he directs several different major research projects across different sport performance discipline areas with several postdocs, PhD to master's students involved. He is also the Director of Sports Science and Sports Medicine for Athletics Canada. His primary sport and research focus is with his physiology and nutrition expertise primarily to Canada's national track and field team. Trent has more than 100 peer-reviewed scientific publications in the areas of exercise physiology, skeletal muscle metabolism, and performance nutrition and supplementation. Furthermore, he has co-authored 7 book chapters focusing on the role that nutrition can play in supporting elite athlete performance. In 2010, Trent was a lead author and presenter for the IOC Consensus Meeting in Nutrition. Over the years, Trent has attended 3 Olympic Games, 4 Commonwealth Games, and 6 World Champions. Trent, thanks for joining us today. Stuart Phillips obtained a PhD from the University of Waterloo in human physiology in 1995. He joined McMaster University in 1999 and is currently a full professor in the Department of Kinesiology and School of Medicine at McMaster University. He is Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Skeletal Muscle Health. He is also the director of the McMaster Centre for Nutrition, Exercise, and Health Research and the Physical Activity Centre of Excellence. Dr. Phillips was the inaugural recipient of the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology Mentorship Award in 2017. In 2018 and 19, he was named the Clairvaux Highly Cited Researchers Site list as being in the top 1% of all cited researchers in nutrition and exercise research. Dr. Phillips is a fellow of the American College of Sports Medicine and the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. Now, without further ado, Trent and Stuart, take it away. Thanks for joining us today.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for that great introduction, and it's a real honor for me to speak here today to tons of people on this topic, and especially an honor to speak with Stu, who's a mentor of mine and a friend and a long colleague. We've had lots of adventures and papers together, and I really want to thank Stu for coming on a bit later to talk about muscle mass and speed power effects. We hope that this is topical given many of us facing global lockdowns right now and training, and I've certainly had a lot of questions about, okay, how much am I going to lose? Can I take a break right now? What should I do for training? I'm not that motivated. And so hopefully we can come across what some of the science shows around this, but also some practical applications throughout the next while. I thought I'd start with some athlete outlook data. I don't believe data like this exists in Canada, so I've taken data that was pushed out last week from the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee, who sent a survey to 4,000 athletes, mainly around their ability to train. And interestingly enough, probably 95% plus, as this graph shows, have had their training moderately, severely impacted, or they're unable to train. So it has a massive impact. And secondly, a lot of athletes, at least a week ago, a third thought they would put their health at risk for training. Um, and a third felt unsure, and a third felt no risk. So obviously, the impact of COVID-19 is large on the ability to train, the quality of training, and most importantly, the impact on an athlete's health. And above and beyond this, obviously, the importance that we need to be placing on our global health recommendations and our world and global community right now. So what we'll do is I'll first look and set this presentation up with looking at training residuals or detraining, mainly from an endurance perspective. Stu will then take over and look at muscle mass preservation and some of the speed power aspects to detraining or minimal training. I'll then talk about and give examples about complete time off and what happens there. I'll have a little bit on exercise and immune function, and then a summary. So let's jump right into this on training residuals and detraining. Normally I take questions throughout the presentation. I think since Stu and I are flipping back and forth, I might suggest that we just take questions at the end. So let's think about the 3 things to consider with each acute training bout. And this is a slide that I presented around coaching education, and I like to keep things really simple. Obviously, around each acute training bout, you and your coach are probably thinking about what is the acute stimulus that you're looking for. And you're thinking about that hopefully from a physiological, but also a psychological and biomechanical perspective to induce the adaptations that you're looking for. And when it comes to acute stimulus, you're thinking about intensity, duration, and frequency. Secondly, you're probably thinking about what is the acute recovery profile or length of time required to recover from all the different training stimuli. Obviously, it takes longer to recover from a really hard, long workout than a short, easy workout. And thirdly, the focus of today's presentation is what is the minimal required training to maintain given adaptations? And that's really probably the simplest definition of a training residual, or the concept of use it or lose it, or minimal effective dose. So when it comes to great detraining, if you're an academic or an applied sports scientist and you want to really dig into the literature, I'll highlight a series of reviews done by a good friend and a good colleague, Inigo Majuka. He's not from Canada. This is a picture I took a few years ago when he was visiting us here in Victoria. He's a proud Basque, and he's from the Basque country, but he's penned a few great reviews on muscular characteristics of detraining and a 2-part series in sports medicine on short-term and long-term adaptations to detraining. So I'll highlight first some short-term changes that happen with detraining. And when I say short-term, I'm talking about 1 or 2 weeks or in that 5 to 10 day range. And a lot of the short-term initial endurance detraining adaptations are cardiovascular in nature. And in this review from Inigo, there's a great table. I hope all of you can see this table with different references. And if we zoom in on that table, indeed, most of the acute changes over 5 to 10 days are cardiovascular in nature. So in as little as 5 to 10 days, you can get a decrease in blood volume. That decrease in blood volume drives an increase in submaximal heart rate when you exercise, decreased stroke volume out of the heart, and obviously decreased maximal cardiac output, given cardiac output is stroke volume multiplied by heart rate. These then lead to a decrease in VO2 max. And this is adaptations that happen quite quickly in as little as 5 to 7 days. So if I think of this visually, it's actually heat acclimation or training endurance training adaptation in reverse. So I'm going to use a visual here from a heat adaptation review that was done by Julian Perard and some other heat experts a few years ago, where they've highlighted, again, if I zoom in here, things like plasma volume shifting in as little as 5 to 6 days, submaximal heart rate dropping with heat adaptation. But instead of reading this slide from left to right in terms of days of heat acclimation, read the slide from right to left and replace this with days of detraining. And indeed, quite acutely and quite shortly, some of your cardiovascular endurance adaptations will decline if you completely stop training. However, the major message that I really want to highlight right now is that once you start up training again and once you get into warm weather again, these adaptations can be gained right back in as little as 5 to 10 days. In fact, plasma volume can shift in as little as 2 days from training. So although these detraining attributes decline quite quickly, they can be regained quite quickly once you get back up to your normal training load. That's an important thing to remember. One aspect to detraining and training residuals that I really need to highlight is that, one, there's not a lot of papers out there in elite athletes. Most of the detraining literature is done in recreational type of subjects, and a lot of them are bed rest type of studies. This is an example of one of the rare studies done in very elite athletes from a few years ago. And in this study, I'll step you through it. They took 14 world-class kayakers that all made the world championships. So they tested them throughout their season, and they tested them before and after 43 weeks of preparation for the world championships. These athletes then had a 4-week taper into the world championships. They tested them right after the world championships, so at peak fitness. And then the intervention started, which was a 5-week period of either training cessation, so absolutely no training, or half of the group got reduced training. And so 7 athletes over 5 weeks did absolutely nothing, and 7 of the 14 athletes did reduced training. And when I say reduced training, I have it up here above. It truly was a massive reduction in training compared to what they would have been doing. It was 2 40-minute moderate intensity endurance sessions per week and 1 weight session per week, and 1 weight session, 3 times 10 reps. World-class canoe kayakers are probably in and around 12 to 16 sessions of training a week, and now they've dropped to 3. 2 light endurance sessions and 1 weight session. And for most of you in endurance sports, this is almost laughable in terms of the amount of training here, but it is interesting to see even this little amount of training and what it does in terms of impact. So let's look at that. Here's the VO2 maxes. Again, these athletes had VO2 maxes close to 75, so they're truly elite. Here's their peak VO2 max in the middle. And after 5 weeks of zero training, indeed, VO2 max dropped by 11%. However, if we looked at the reduced training group, they still had a drop in VO2 max, but it was only 5% or half of the other group. So even just a very small amount of training, 2 by 40 minutes once a week, or 2 by 40 minutes per week, which is almost nothing for an endurance athlete, can really help still maintain some of those VO2 max outcomes. And again, on average, all of these athletes are still above 70 with just reduced training. Let's look at some of the strength outcomes. Here's bench press and prone bench pull, and estimates of 1 repetition max strength. Again, with 5 weeks of no training, you get about an 8 to 9% drop in peak strength, or 1 RM strength, excuse me. But with just 1 resistance training session per week, there was only a 4% drop. And so the real take home I'm trying to emphasize here is that very little levels of training can really help attenuate the declines that you might see in some of your fitness gains. This is an area that needs a lot more research in elite athletes for sure, but this is one of the rare papers done in world championship level athletes. Let's have a look at some of the enzymes in terms of their decline with zero training. So a lot of this comes from bed rest studies. And I've highlighted here that some of these enzymes down here, like citrate synthase, which is within the mitochondria, are mitochondrial or aerobic enzymes, while some of the enzymes up here, like lactate dehydrogenase or phosphofructokinase, are glycolytic or anaerobic enzymes. And here's the percent change in these enzyme markers, which can be markers of fitness over days without training. And indeed, the aerobic system does erode in terms of mitochondrial enzymes at about 10% per week. But what's interesting is that a lot of the glycolytic and anaerobic enzymes show very little change, in fact. And so, again, this is an important aspect to consider, is that some of the erosion of fitness parameters will probably be more pronounced in the aerobic system than the glycolytic or anaerobic system. Indeed, the aerobic system is much more trainable as well. We probably have way more information to support that than the anaerobic glycolytic system, which is still trainable, but much less so than the aerobic system. And here's another graph showing the same type of phenomenon. Again, citrate synthase is a mitochondrial enzyme. This is from David Bishop, who does tons of research on mitochondrial content and density and efficiency of under different types of exercise. And again, we see about 10% per week. I'll highlight a review cautiously by Vladimir Issarin from 10 years ago. This review was a large review on contemporary methods of training periodization, but did feature some concepts and ideas around training residuals or detraining. I want to stress that this review is more conceptual in nature and is more a reflection of Vladimir Issarin's experiences with athletes and coaches over many years than based on really hard research. So that's important to recognize. But he does make some points here in Table 3 in this review on factors affecting the duration of short-term training residuals. So how long you can have a training adaptation over time. Again, I wouldn't say there's a ton of papers. He's basing this off just 4 here in terms of the references at the top, and is again based more on a conceptual model, but there is some common sense pieces here. So for example, factor 1, the duration of training before cessation or before stopping. So an individual that is has had longer training and uninterrupted training before a stop, such as right now, is going to have a longer training residual. Load concentration level of training before cessation. The evidence for this is probably weaker, but in this review, he highlights that very concentrated specific training might erode quicker or have a shorter residual than more complex multi-component training. The age and duration of the athletes, older and more experienced athletes have longer residuals. They have years and years and years of training in there, and therefore the washout or the detraining will take a lot longer. The character of preparation after stopping of concentrated training. Basically here he's saying use of appropriate stimulatory loads allows prolonged residuals and prevents fast detraining. That supports the study we just saw in kayakers. Even probably 1/10 of the training that they normally do really helped with maintaining adaptations. And then finally, he highlights biological nature of developing abilities, or the abilities associated with pronounced morphological and biochemical changes like muscle strength and aerobic endurance probably have longer residuals, so they last longer without training than anaerobic and glycolytic abilities. And again, I showed you that with some of that mitochondrial enzyme. In one of his presentations, Vladimir Issarin, and this is a slide from one of his presentation, looked at residual training effects over days. Again, this is a conceptual model. I've added in error bars here that look a bit sloppy, but just to try to explain and show to everyone that there's probably huge variability here, but that aerobic adaptations probably last the longest compared to your glycolytic and speed type adaptations, or adaptations that are more neuromuscular in basis. So that just gives you a bit of a concept, and depending what type of training you do or primarily do, and where to consider. But it's a concept, again, of fast in, fast out. So you can also get huge gains in the weight room and on short speed quite quickly relative to some of the more longer term aerobic endurance adaptations. So that is some of the training residual information from an endurance side of things. I believe Kendra, our moderator, is now going to switch over slides and I'll have Professor Stu Phillips take over. Stu has probably forgot more about muscle than I'll ever know. So when I was putting this presentation together, I thought, what a better person in Canada as an absolute muscle expert to lead us through this section. So Stu, I know you're absolutely swamped with classes, requests, and everything else. But thank you so much for joining us today, and I owe you big time, buddy. Thanks. I'll mute myself now, and you can take over.
Okay, thank you very much, Trent. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be on the program this afternoon, and really excited to talk to at least 77 people who have tuned in, and this will also be recorded so that people can take a look at it later. So I thought what I would do is walk you through some of our work using less than typical loads and the effects that they can have on muscle mass, and then give you a quick sort of thumbnail sketch of what we know about retention of strength and power with respect to if we were put in less than ideal circumstances like we are now. Maybe we don't have access to equipment, maybe we can't train as we usually would. What could we do to preserve the gains that we've made and to at least keep ourselves in shape and ready for when this all subsides? So the current guidelines for the development of strength look something like this. I've chosen ACSM, but I could just as easily pick a number of other organizations. The strength is developed when loads between 85 to 100% of 1 RM, 2 to 6 repetitions, about 1 to 2 sets with a progression with experience. Hypertrophy is optimized between 60 to 80% of 1 RM, again around 8 to 12 repetitions, and between 3 to 6 sets, with some redundancy, of course, between body parts. And muscular endurance is developed at loads between 30 to 50% of 1 RM, 20 plus repetitions, with really the recommendation that you can do almost as much as you want. And the question I want to pose to you is, what is the evidence on which these guidelines are based? And I think this is probably a study, or possibly the most widely cited study on which these guidelines rest. Namely, there were 4 groups in this example where they had a control, a low repetition, so a high weight, an intermediate repetition, and a high repetition, and these are the 1 RM changes in leg press, leg squat, and leg extension. And you can see exactly what the guidelines would reflect. In other words, there's development of strength that is greater with the low repetition group and not as great with the high repetition group. Interestingly, when you look at the changes in muscle fiber cross-sectional area, and I apologize for the tabular presentation here, but what you can see is that the low repetition group did have had gains in fiber cross-sectional area that were similar in nature to what the intermediate group, but the high repetition group didn't demonstrate this muscular gain. So again, supporting the guidelines that hypertrophy is probably maximized somewhere in that intermediate repetition range, or maybe even at lower repetitions, but not at higher repetitions. Or perhaps this is the study that is really the basis for some of these guidelines, and it goes back, and if you recognize Captain Thomas DeLorme in the top right there, congratulations. And he published a study in 1946 in the Archives of Physical Medicine entitled Heavy Resistance Exercises. Now in 1946, Thomas DeLorme was rehabilitating obviously soldiers that were returning from World War II, and he made some observations that were counterintuitive at the time. He wrote that most injuries of the trunk and extremities would really benefit from the redevelopment of muscle power, and I think he's misusing the term here. What he's really talking about is muscle force as the most important factor in restoring normal function. At the same time, heavy resistance and low repetition exercise was better for developing muscular strength. And he said that rather than attempt to develop endurance, that to restore muscle strength to normal, and then to build endurance by means of low resistance, high repetition exercises. And that's the fundamental statement on which a lot of the guidelines still rest. And of course, a number of empirical evidence. The question we asked ourselves a number of years ago is the paradigm correct? Does external load drive hypertrophy? With the recognition that at momentary muscular failure, all motor units are recruited regardless of the load that is used, because that's how the size principle works. And yet, people still today fail to recognize this. If you'd like to read even deeper on this, you can look at our paper that was published in 2019, looking at muscle fiber activation and showing that it was unaffected by load so long as you worked to momentary muscular failure. The first paper that we performed in this series of studies came out in 2010, and that's Dr. Nick Bird in the top right, a former PhD student of mine, where we utilized a unilateral model and had subjects lift at 90% of 1 RM to failure, 90% of 1 RM, to failure, 30% of 1 RM to work match the 90%, or 30% of 1 RM to failure. The trick with using lower loads is that, of course, you're able to do much greater amount of work before failure occurs. This shows you the molecular level response of what we call mixed muscle protein fractional synthetic rate. So this is protein synthesis. And what should immediately jump out is the rates of protein synthesis 4 and 24 hours after exercise are similar in the 90 fail and the 30 fail groups. If you match the amount of work that's done at the lower intensity, you get a suboptimal stimulus. And so clearly muscular failure is an important part of stimulating this response. So the conclusion from this paper was that low load, high volume resistance exercise is actually, if not equivalent, maybe even more effective, and I didn't show you this data, than high load, low volume work. However, we received a number of unofficial critiques of this paper, despite the fact that it appeared in a good journal. We often receive peer review from sources like Twitter and Facebook. This is just muscle protein synthesis and not hypertrophy, and that's entirely correct. Who lifts at 30%? You're not going to get stronger that way, and that may be the case. So we performed a second study, and this is Cameron Mitchell. This was part of his PhD thesis, in which the purpose was to test in a longer-term model repetition ranges at 30% and 80% now, so a little bit lower than the 90%, in inducing muscular hypertrophy. The hypothesis was that resistance training at 30% should result in muscle hypertrophy, at least based on the prolonged stimulation of myofibrillar protein synthesis that was equivalent to training with heavier loads. And that's in fact what we saw. You can see that this is the change in quadriceps volume. I could show you a number of other outcomes, but it's similar, in fact, it's almost identical to that seen with 80% versus 30%. Interestingly enough, in complete alignment with the recommendations by the ACSM, you can see that when we train at low loads, we don't get as great of a strength increase as when we're training at higher loads. However, when we give these subjects a non-practice task, in this case isometric torque, you can actually see that the changes in strength were no different between each other. So the question I would ask is whether the adaptation seen in the 80% group is merely because they're training at a closer range to their 1 repetition max that we're measuring in this test. So is it just practice? So the conclusion from this paper was that in accordance with our acute measures of muscle protein synthesis and rates lifted at lower load to failure resulted in hypertrophy as the heavy load lifted to failure. From Twitter and Facebook, of course, it's a unilateral design, so who really cares about these data? These were naive, untrained subjects who respond to everything, the so-called new gains effect, and see, lifting at 30%, you don't get as strong, so who really cares? So we designed a third study, and this time we took trained participants. We used a non-unilateral design with sufficient power, in other words, groups that were large enough to detect differences if they existed, and you really need about 20 to 25 people per group to see this. And we try to make people as strong using a lower load as possible. And the realization that you're never going to please anybody. This is work that was published by Sarah Oikawa and Rob Morton. And in this design, we used 25 men per group. We matched them for strength and lean mass, and we trained them using low repetitions or high repetitions. So the sets to fatigue were between 8 to 12 or 20 to 25 reps. And we tested their 1RM strength every third week. So we gave everybody a chance to practicing lifting their 1RM. We did biopsies, we took DEXA measurements, and we also made a number of hormonal measurements as well. Quite simply, the change in whole body lean mass measured by DEXA was not different between the high repetition and low repetition groups. Similarly, there was no difference between the groups for any of the strength measures, with the exception of bench press, which showed a small and yet significant superior gain in the low repetition group. Interestingly enough, the conclusion from this paper was that resistance exercise load does not determine hypertrophy or strength gains in trained young men. We saw no differences in the increase in lean mass or muscle fiber cross-sectional area or differences between fibers, and we saw no difference in strength with the exception of the bench press. However, there were many critiques, and if you search on YouTube, you can spend about an hour listening to an in-depth critique of this study. Nonetheless, I think we're looking for evidence-based answers to a number of questions. And really, I have to give Brad Schoenfeld and his group with Jim Krieger and Jozo Grigic here credit in that they brought us a number of answers. So in this meta-analysis, they're looking at how many times per week should a muscle be trained to maximize muscle hypertrophy. I don't give any pictures in these, and unfortunately, I'm just going to rely on the word description here. 0 on the red text. Resistance training does not significantly or meaningfully impact muscle hypertrophy. So somewhere between 1 to 3 days per week. If you want a take-home message, I think it's this: between 1 to 3 sessions per week. If you're doing less, maybe it's 1 session or 2, then you can make up for that with a greater volume within that 1 session. So when you equate the volume between either 1 or 3, in other words, this meta-analysis would conclude that there's no difference. So that's the state of the art in terms of science for hypertrophy. When we talk about strength, again, the same authors with a few more added in here. And we're talking about a significant effect of resistance training frequency. However, it's primarily driven by resistance training volume, because when volume was equated, there was no significant effect of resistance training frequency. So you can again have a take-home message here that is training between 1 to 3 sessions per week. If it is less, so in the 1 to 2 session range, then higher volume, and if you have access to them, obviously heavier weights. When we talk about a minimally effective dose, this becomes rather difficult. And this study from James Steele and James Fisher really gave us, I think, an interesting conclusion to look at how little or how low can I do. And remember, this is for the development of strength. So it's sort of the flip side, similar to the graph that Trent presented to you with the adaptations. Instead of reading from left to right, you would read from right to left. So what they concluded was that a single set of 6 to 12 repetitions with loads ranging from approximately 70 to 85% of 1RM 2 to 3 times per week within high intensity of effort, somewhere where you're reaching volitional fatigue or momentary failure, can produce suboptimal. In other words, it was statistically significantly different, but significant increases in squat and bench press 1RM. I think the point here would be to make that if you have no equipment around, simply doing some form of body weight exercise, even in a small volume, would help you retain some of the gains that you have made. So one set between 6 to 12 repetitions, 2 to 3 times per week, go to failure. And if you need an idea of what failure is, you should familiarize yourself with the Borg scale. So this is the 10-point Borg scale. It's a tool that we use quite often actually with our older clients at the Physical Activity Center of Excellence. And it is really excellent to guide people in how to titrate the effort that they're giving during a resistance training session. Power is something that probably disappears more quickly than either strength or mass. And so it's really difficult to define how we would maintain muscular power. However, I think the optimal load for the development of power bears some consideration here. So this is a meta-analysis, and what you can see is that a range of loads from moderate to lighter loads to heavier loads result in generation of power that is greater depending on the lift that you're performing. So it might be lift specific, so power cleans and hang cleans would require access to heavier weights, whereas lighter loads show the highest peak power production, for example, in a jump squat. If you remember the force velocity curve, then you can see that power can be developed by enhancing force or to some degree by enhancing velocity. However, it would shift the curve specific to the range in which you're performing those repetitions. So I think the take-home message really here is that multiple load ranges work to maintain velocity, and it can be done with body weight work. Just a brief word, however, on what I call intention or focus. And I'm going to go back in the literature to 1993 to a great mentor of mine, Digby Sale, working with Dave Boehm, who I'm sure a lot of you know from his work on a variety of different topics. And in this study, it's just to make the point that it is the intended rather than the actual movement velocity that determines the specific training response. So working with intention or focus shows you here that the principal stimuli for the high velocity training response are the repeated attempts to perform ballistic contractions. So I think what we should really be telling athletes during this phase is try to perform quality repetitions with intention and focus. So what I've told you in the recommendations that I would have during this tough time. First, lighter weights lifted to the point of volitional fatigue work to enhance gains and prevent losses of muscle mass. We should aim for 3 sessions weekly, but if we're doing less, we should make up for that in terms of a high volume session. Volume can be increased, as I said then, if the desired frequency is less. Increases in power are possible using a wide variety of loads, and that athletes should work with intention and focus. In other words, trying to perform high quality work as opposed to simply putting time in at the gym. Thanks very much. Turn it back to you, Trent.
Thank you very much, Stu. That was an awesome overview, and it gives us lots of ideas and insights and thoughts about, the impact that lower loads to failure can have, maybe even from not only for COVID-19 and isolated athletes, but from injury rehab and aspects of that as well. So, any of you, if you have questions for Stu, just save them. I'll get through this last section, and we'll do the Q&A right at the end. Let's do slides. There we go. I did want to highlight maybe 2 slides here on just being aware of training interference and the concept that working with your coaches and working with your strength and conditioning coaches during this time when you might be limited in equipment and facilities and have to be creative, that you should ideally focus on your sport's first principles first, or the major KPIs that will induce the best adaptations that you have. And as a meta-analysis done, I like this one, although it's 8 years old now, looking at the interference effect between endurance and strength outcomes, or in this instance, I can get my pointer, hypertrophy, strength, and power. And this was done in 21 studies, so quite a large outcome. And again, I know it's from 2012, but these visuals are well done. So you can see a drop off in hypertrophy, strength, and power when endurance training starts to get up over 2 or 3 days a week. So again, if you're a speed power athlete and all of a sudden you're at home and you have access to a bike or a treadmill and you have time on your hands, just be aware a little bit, and probably first and foremost always check with your coaches first. If I move forward, the same concept is seen around minutes of endurance exercise per day, and that once you get over 30 or 40 minutes, you're starting to get a drop off in hypertrophy, strength, and power. I believe the very first interference study done looking at strength and endurance was in 1980 by Hickson et al., where they had 3 groups do 10 weeks of training. They had a strength-only group, an endurance-only group, and a strength and endurance group. And they looked at strength outcomes and endurance outcomes every single week. And I'll start here on the strength outcomes. First of all, the endurance training group really had no increases in strength outcomes here. The strength-only group showed continuous rise in strength outcomes throughout the 10 weeks, while the strength and endurance or concurrent training group showed rises, but they seemed to really plateau after about 5 weeks and started to actually decline a little bit. Interestingly enough, the endurance and strength and endurance group both showed similar rises in cycling performance. So I think a key outcome of a lot of the concurrent training and interference data might be something like this. Resistance training does not affect endurance training as much as endurance training negatively affecting resistance training in terms of those performance outcomes. So that is just a little bit on concurrent training and the interference between concurrent training, just to frame that up. Now, what about complete time off? In some instances, perhaps you have zero access. I'm thinking about swimmers to to swimming pools, or perhaps motivation's low. More on that later. But there are instances where some world-class athletes do have probably at least 6 to 12 months completely off. And those are some of our amazing female athletes who come back just as strong as ever post-pregnancy. And here's a great case study of Marit Bogdan and her time off and all the training, and it's out of Norway. And you can see, and as the Norwegians do so well, they've highlighted all their training adaptations throughout that time. And this is an impressive study showing how after long layoffs, athletes can still be quite successful. And indeed, I've had the pleasure and honor of working with numerous female track and field athletes who have run just as fast, and in some instances faster than ever after having babies. For example, Melinda Elmore just set the Canadian record in the marathon after 2 children. So for the males in the group, this is absolutely achievable. And I'm sure a lot of the moms right now with the delay and the COVID who are still training are way less worried because they know they've had time off before and they've come back just as strong, if not stronger. Elite marathoners from Kenya routinely take at least a month off after every single marathon. Kipchoge, the marathon record holder, for example, and Paul Turgott, the former record holder, was quoted as taking 20 to 30 days of complete rest post-marathon, both physically and mentally, with no running whatsoever, was something he commonly addressed as both intelligent and needed. So again, an example where some days off at this juncture with competition so far off probably will not hurt you whatsoever. What about unretiring after 7 years? Brent Hayden was on an unbelievably awesome comeback this year, and I'm sure that comeback will continue into 2027, where after 7 years away, he still swam an Olympic A time. And finally, a rower case study. So this is a case study published with an Olympic gold medalist rower, where they undertook physiological testing at 4 times. One was right prior to the Olympics in peak shape. The next time was 8 weeks of complete detraining, so absolutely nothing. The third test was 8 weeks of retraining, and then the fourth test was 20 weeks or 5 months of retraining. So to put that timeline in perspective, if we went through 8 weeks of no training, 8 weeks of retraining, and then another 20 weeks of retraining, that would bring us to December at the end of this year. And in rowing, 2 key outcomes that really correlate and impact performance directly are power at VO2 max, so in watts, and power at 4 millimole, also in watts. So this is this athlete's peak power, or power at VO2 max and power at 4 millimole. After 8 weeks of detraining, there was about a 20% drop in power. After 8 weeks of retraining, about 12 to 15% of that power was recovered, and so the deficit was now only at 8%. And interestingly enough, after 20 weeks of retraining, even though this is year one of the quad, and one would assume this athlete was all in for the Olympics, they actually showed a small +1 and +2% increase in power at VO2 max and power at 4 millimole. This is probably right within the noise of what we can accurately measure, so it's probably equivalent, but it does suggest that some time off certainly doesn't seem to negatively impact power at VO2 max or power at 4 millimole. It might actually even further help after some rest and recovery. I also think back to a few years ago, Matt Heyman, a professional cyclist who broke his arm, I think 6 or 8 weeks before the Paris-Roubaix race, a super famous one-day cycling classic, and he roared back and won that. And so sometimes a short break actually can benefit and refresh an athlete physically and mentally. So what about exercise and immune function? Stu and I are not immunologists or exercise immunologists, but I have got a few questions, and I will bring up a few slides on this. First of all, there is a theoretical J or U-shaped curve with the idea that normal immune function or risk for an upper respiratory tract infection, which is basically what COVID is, actually the risk goes down for that if you train moderately. So exercise and health helps your immune system. However, heavy exertion or extreme training loads significantly increases your risk for illness. And this is a theoretical curve that's been around for a long, long time. And then in 2007, a study actually put some numbers to this. So this is the number of illness episodes here on the y-axis. Here we have our sedentary controls, recreationally competitive athletes, so doing moderate amounts of training, a slightly lower number of upper respiratory tract infections, and then our elite athletes. So something to consider as well in terms of what your own risk profile is and personal choices around risk of illness. I love helping coaches design workouts that mimic the really hard specificity of competition demands. Not only will this kind of workout kill you, it will hurt the whole time you're dying. But perhaps, again, if you're worried about your immune function for the next couple of weeks or months, you would pull back on these type of really big, massive sessions. And so here's a study published about 10 years ago by the Norwegian Olympic team, looking at a top secret, cutting edge, scientifically proven approach to illness prevention. At the 2006 Olympics, the Norwegian Olympic team had an illness rate of 17%. And using this top secret, cutting edge, scientifically proven approach, they dropped their illness rate to 5%. And what did they do? They recommended flu shots. They implemented nearly obsessive compulsive hand washing, avoiding handshakes and other close physical contact. The use of hand sanitizers. They decreased exposure to high-risk environments such as ill family or friends or high-traffic public areas. They optimized hydration, sleep, and nutrition, and they increased their vigilance. I think I made this slide 10 years ago. I have not adjusted those wordings whatsoever for this presentation, and it's pretty much exactly what all of our public health offices are recommending during this pandemic. If you're further interested in exercise and immune function, I would highlight Professor Neil Walsh. He's active on Twitter, and last week posted up 10 ways athletes can avoid infection and maintain immunity. Again, Neil is the real expert here. He was the lead author down here of the 2018 consensus statement on recommendations to maintain immune health in athletes. I believe that's an open access paper if you're interested. So what does he say? Try to avoid sick people. 2, ensure good hygiene and proper vaccinations. 3, avoid self-inoculation by touching eyes, nose, mouth. Do not train with below the neck symptoms. 5, monitor and manage all forms of stress, including psychosocial and physical. Carefully manage increases in training stress, as I mentioned earlier. Replace overly long training sessions with more frequent sessions. So it does appear that very long, hard sessions, probably linked in with some carbohydrate availability, as carbohydrate and immune cells go hand in hand, are probably the main ones to avoid or to back off of a little bit. Plan recovery every second to third week. Aim for great sleep, more than 7 hours a night, and eat a well-balanced diet and avoid chronic low energy availability, or REDS, relative energy deficiency, in sport. So that's from the immune expert there. So in the last 5 minutes here, I'll just try to summarize everything that we've heard and make some more general recommendations for all of you, some more applied recommendations, and then we'll take a Q&A. And I thought I'd start with a slide that I use in coaching education. And these are, 8 steps to periodization. And step 1 is select major competition dates requiring optimal performance, work back from there. Incorporate minor competitions next. Well, on March 24th, 2020, the IOC and the International Paralympic Committee announced the postponement of the Games. We don't even know when the Games are going to be. So we can't even do step 1 for periodization. We don't even know when minor competitions are going to come on board. So step 1 already impossible to do at this point. But interestingly enough, step 8 is retain elements of adaptability and flexibility. So we can still do that, and we can still focus on some of the elements that Stu and I have highlighted here today around training residuals. And there's a science and art of coaching. And at this point, we should still plan ahead, but more than ever in our current pandemic, plan in pencil so we can make adjustments and retain flexibility. So what are some perhaps practical recommendations for season planning right now? If you're an athlete, find a new balance and try to get into a new routine with input from your coach. It does take a little while to get into a routine, but try to set a routine. Think long term and think of exercising right now for mental and physical health, not hardcore training for performance, at least for the next few weeks or months. Talk to your coach, but you might consider just getting back to the basics and focus more on general training specific to your sport. I would recommend ideally keeping some elements of neuromuscular and biomechanical demands, so some intensity and specificity of your sport, just perhaps at slightly lower volumes. If you haven't done some of those intense pieces, if all of a sudden things look really good and there is going to be a season in August and September, you will probably predispose yourself to a large increase in potential injury. So I would just keep some of that in there ticking over. But let's keep it simple. Let's not rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic. Perhaps you could talk to your therapist, your coach, your strength and conditioning coach, and focus on some biomechanical deficiencies, or perhaps you have some niggles or injuries. Maybe your shoulder stability or hips or hamstring injuries right now. Well, now is the time to work on your chassis and have time so that your chassis and your structure is nice and strong for when you can return to full training. Find things that are fun and motivating. What are your favorite types of sessions or virtual sessions? And as I said earlier, now is not the time to set all-time personal bests. Keep your immune system optimized, but as elite athletes, you can certainly keep things ticking over at a moderate or normal level. Your moderate or normal level is way more than most normal humans do. But as long as that's normal for you and your immune system's been good off of that, then there's no problem continuing with that level. Of course, if you're motivated and it's possible in your current context. Some of us can slip out for an independent run on the trail. Other countries are in complete lockdown. Swimmers don't have access to pools, so it really depends. I'll highlight a visual of good and bad stress. I think all of us have a capacity for stress, and if we think of our capacity as a glass, then this analogy hopefully will resonate with you. The bigger the glass, the more the capacity for stress. And if we think of water in that glass, if water runs over the top of the glass, that's when we get sick or injured. So there's good stress that we can put into our glass. Planned periodization, planned fatigue, optimal competition, excitement, and arousal. Unfortunately, there's bad stress that we want to minimize going into that glass. Lack of sleep, poor nutrition, non-planned exercise, and some of the things here at the bottom: performance anxiety, personal emotional stress, COVID-19 stress or isolation. So obviously, if some of that has went up for you in your context, then some of the good stress probably needs to be backed off a little bit. Or we need to further focus on de-stressing and leaking out stress through optimal sleep, recovery habits, connection, health, happiness, life balance. So what can you do as an athlete during this pandemic? First and foremost, self-isolate, practice exceptional hygiene, follow all your local health recommendations. And in general, if there's two things, it's wash your hands a lot and social distancing or stay away. Two, athletes, you can continue to be leaders. Many young athletes, fans are looking up to you right now. Set a positive example around point number one and engage with them virtually. Easy, moderate, or normal levels of isolated training will physically set you up just fine for when you can train in earnest again. I hope that message came loud and clear over the last 45 minutes. Maybe you could work on lifestyle gaps or injury gaps, nutrition, sleep routines, improving some of these biomechanical aspects or skills as they'll only translate later. Reach out to family, teammates, friends to keep each other supported and motivated and positive. And finally, I'll just repeat number one again so it's really clear. Self-isolate, practice exceptional hygiene, follow all local health recommendations. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much. Again, thank you, Stu, for stepping in and covering off the power hypertrophy part. And I think we can take a few questions. I have at least 10 or 15 minutes still.
Thanks, Stuart and Trent. Again, I really appreciate you guys jumping on for this important webinar. As you guys are typing away your questions for these two, I just want to jump on and thank you guys. We will be releasing this recorded webinar on our on-demand page by Monday. So for those wanting to watch it again, it will be available on our website.
Okay, I see one here from David Driscoll. That was probably back on the paradoxical information that I might have shown on the enzyme data versus Vladimir Isrin's recommendations around residuals. I'll try and address that here. Let me think. Yes, the enzyme data showed 10% per week declines in aerobic enzymes, but a maintenance in glycolytic enzymes. Yet opposite to that, Isrin suggests that aerobic adaptations have the longest residuals. First and foremost, as I said, there's little scientific validation around some of those residuals. I do think we have to think about differently about total aerobic adaptation residuals versus just enzyme declines. So when I think about adaptations to aerobic training, yes, I think about enzymes, but I would also think about capillarization, which some data suggests can take many, many, many years. Perhaps over many years of training, there's some evidence of slow changes to background fiber typing. There's large slow changes to left ventricular hypertrophy in the heart for cardiac output. I'm thinking about gene or signaling protein content that also would impact how slowly aerobic adaptations wash out beyond just the enzyme data. But I don't have an exact answer other than to think about the totality of that rather than just the enzyme data.
Trent, do you think I could jump in here?
Oh God, yes, Stu, please. If you got better insights, fire away, bud.
Sure. No, I have nothing to add to what you've just said. I think that was fantastic. There are a couple of questions here. One from Tyson said, question regarding strength training. If doing fewer sessions then do higher volume, can we give an example to show what is meant by higher volume? More sets, reps, lifts, weight. So, my assumption in making these recommendations was that people wouldn't have access to the weights that they might normally lift in the gym. So I think what we're talking about is more sets, but at lower weights if you can. I mean, if people only have access to their body weight, then it's repetitions that become close to fatigue, around an 8 or 9 out of 10, as we said on the perceived exertion scale. That's what I would scale up. So if you're doing fewer sessions, then try and really focus on doing quality repetitions, but increasing the volume of them. So I'd add sets or different types of exercises that are redundant, and follow that prescription. And there's a question.
Great, and I scroll.
Sorry, go ahead.
Awesome, Stu. And I just scrolled down and I've seen another question here from Julia. Was the study in Olympic rowers a single person or aggregate data? It was a case study, so it was just a single rower. I believe it was a rower from the UK 2000 Olympic gold 4. So there was a couple of pretty good rowers in that. So yeah, it was just a representation of one. And then Susan, if an athlete normally trains 2 to 3 times a day, 6 days a week, should this amount of training be reduced or just the type of training? So first and foremost, Suzanne, I think you need to talk to your coaches and talk to some of your other collaborators who work with you on your program or whatever sport you're in. Secondly, it might depend on the context that you're in terms of whether you can still train like that and socially isolate. It's a lot easier for a runner maybe to go out on a trail and get a run than a swimmer or a weightlifter who needs very specific equipment in a gym. So these are all considerations that change your risk profile for COVID-19 and that you have to consider. From a purely immune perspective, if that's your normal load, you might back off a little bit, and you might back off a little bit more on really long, hard, intense workouts just to make sure your immune system is ticking over. But I don't think you would need a radical change if that's your normal level of training and it's achievable. And off of that normal level of training, you generally have a pretty robust immune system. If that's your normal level of training and you got sick 10 times last year, well, then you're probably going to have to back it off a bit more than what I've just said. So there's a lot of context there, but hopefully that helps.
I have a question here from Dave Driscoll. He said, could this be seen as an enhanced off season? It's a great chance to get better nutrition, more rest. And, you know, I think that that's a great way of looking at it. I think it probably rest for a lot of athletes is sort of the forgotten variable. I always tell people that training sessions are great, but all the good stuff happens in recovery or rest. And really, there's only really one way to look at this. You know, it's a chance to get yourself in shape and maybe take a little bit of a mental break, even though there is some stress associated with just sitting around, obviously. But yeah, try and turn it into your advantage and recover and come back a little bit stronger. I see a question here from Sean as well. Does protein and energy intake recommendations remain the same for these adapted training sessions? You know, obviously people are probably going to be doing a little bit less, and I think that Trent's point around immune function would really go to the point of not trying to do more prolonged sessions and really trying to focus on quality work and keeping the intensity as high as possible. And in those situations, you're going to have to dial the energy intake down so that we can sort of head off a little bit of weight gain if it's going to happen. But at the same time, in the off season, most athletes tend to get a little bit heavier and come back a little bit stronger, ready to start. I mean, no athlete is in as good a shape from a rest standpoint as at the start of the season. So let's kind of look at it that way, and I think that that's you know, one way to try and, you know, cope with this.
Yeah, I would agree on the energy side of things. Is if if we're not looking to compete again for quite a while, then it's absolutely okay that body composition goes up a little bit right now. I would encourage it. That energy availability will help your immune system and probably help your mind as well. But it needs to be held in check and not overdone as well. Stu, there's one from Sven here about older athletes.
Yeah.
Maybe that one's more in your wheelhouse.
I saw that, and
I'm not calling you old, by the way. Sorry.
I know that's true. I saw that. Let me say this: is that as elite athletes, elite masters athletes, as you get older, I think the thing that really begins to suffer a little bit is recovery time, and it's not really soft tissue recovery. It's more to do with connective tissue recovery. So joints ache for longer, and most older masters athletes find that the recovery takes a bit longer. So from their perspective, I don't know that this is such a bad thing. But I will say this, is that as you get older, obviously, you're fighting a decline due to aging. And so it will be sort of emphasized, if you want to come back as strong as possible, is that you should try and maintain some kind of training stimulus. And I would recommend a little bit of extra protein during this phase to enhance the repair. We've got a lot of data showing that as older people, they don't respond quite as well to protein. Masters athletes are probably a little bit different, but even work that we did in collaboration with an Australian group showed that they were also a little bit refractory to protein provision. So I'd recommend high quality sources of protein. Try and vary your food as much as possible and maintain that training stimulus.
Yeah, and I coach a couple of masters level runners, and one of the biggest things I did with their programs is at certain times of the year, instead of going on a classic 7-day cycle, we'll push it up to a 10-day cycle. So we'll still do 3 hard workouts, but instead of doing that within 7 days, we just do it over 10 days. And what it does is it spaces out the training density a little bit and allows a little more enhanced recovery. And I've seen really good benefits of that. So that might be another thing to play around with during this time. And if you're a coach, if you're an athlete, talk to your coach. And if you're a coach, you could consider it. And I see Lister here saying it is a time to maybe try different training schedules or different sequencing that is not possible during school and other work schedules. And yeah, totally correct. And again, work with your coach, or if you're an athlete, to talk about those options or ways to make it fun or ways to keep you motivated. Any last questions? It's Friday afternoon. Stu needs to start his weekend, and and I have a few hours left here. So as a few people, maybe give them a chance to ask a few more questions. Again, Stu, thanks so much for jumping on here. I know we had a lot of requests from around the world as well, and I think hopefully there's some reassurance here for everyone that during this insane pandemic, let's focus on our global community first. We can tick over the training just fine, and with minimal effective dose and great training residuals in our elite athletes, it's going to be okay. And I'm one as well that struggles with unknowns and not knowing when our next competition is or when the Olympics are, but we can work on that together. So thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Trent and Stu. I really appreciate you guys jumping on for this, and thanks everyone for tuning in for today's speaker series. Like Trent said, we will be okay, and I look forward to having you guys jump on our next speaker series, which is happening this Tuesday on building resilience with Dr. Mustafa Sarkar at 3 p.m. So on behalf of CSI Pacific, I'd like to wish you all a fabulous rest of your day, and hang in there. Bye-bye.